My 6-year-old son leaned into my ear one Thursday morning and whispered something no child should ever know. The house was still dark, the kind of pre-dawn darkness that makes everything feel suspended in time. I was packing my suitcase for a business trip to Atlanta, folding blouses mechanically while my mind ran through presentations and client meetings. Then I felt his small hand on my arm, his breath warm against my cheek, and he said words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. "Mommy, Daddy has a lover. And when you travel, they're going to take all your money." I laughed. Not a real laugh, but that nervous sound you make when a child says something so absurd it can only be imagination. I turned to look at him, expecting to see that mischievous grin he gets when he's making up stories about dragons or superheroes. But his face was serious, his brown eyes wider than they should be at 6:30 in the morning. "What did you say, sweetheart?" I asked, my hands frozen mid-fold on a navy blazer. He repeated it, word for word, with the same inflection, like he was reciting something he'd heard many times before. My heart started beating faster, but I told myself it was nothing. Children say strange things. They overhear adult conversations and remix them into nonsense. I kissed his forehead and told him to go back to bed, that Mommy had to finish packing. 3 days later, sitting in a lawyer's office with bank statements spread across a mahogany desk, I realized my son had just saved my life. If you're watching this right now, understand something. This isn't just another story about infidelity. This is about manipulation, money, and the moment a mother stopped trusting her instincts and started trusting her child. Before you click away, I need you to stay until the end, because what I uncovered wasn't just betrayal, it was a plan years in the making, and if I had boarded that plane to Atlanta, everything I had built would have been legally stripped away before I ever returned home. Drop a comment with your state if you're watching. I want to know who's with me on this journey. Let me take you back to before the whisper, before the unraveling, to when life was exactly what it appeared to be. My name is Sarah, and for 12 years I had what everyone called a perfect marriage. Michael and I met in our late 20s at a corporate mixer, one of those forced networking events where everyone pretends the small talk isn't painful. He was different though, genuinely funny, with this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. We dated for 2 years before he proposed on a beach in South Carolina, the sunset so perfectly timed it looked staged. Our wedding was small but beautiful, surrounded by family and friends who all agreed we were meant for each other. We bought a 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs, the kind with a 2-car garage and a backyard big enough for a swing set. I worked in pharmaceutical sales, traveling about twice a month to conferences and client presentations. Michael worked in financial consulting, managing investment portfolios for small businesses. We had separate careers but shared everything else: a joint checking account, retirement funds, a son named Dylan who was born 3 years into our marriage, and another boy, Ethan, who came 2 years after that. On paper, we were living the American dream. Sunday morning pancakes, family movie nights, annual beach vacations where we'd take hundreds of photos that I'd organize into albums neither of us ever looked at. But beneath that surface, there were hairline cracks I'd learned to ignore. Michael had always handled our finances because, as he put it, he was good with numbers, and I was good with people. It made sense at the time, a natural division of labor that let me focus on my career without worrying about bill payments or investment strategies. He'd show me quarterly reports, talk about diversified portfolios and compound interest, and I'd nod along, trusting that he was building our future. When I'd suggest looking at the accounts together or maybe taking a financial planning class as a couple, he'd wave it off with a smile. "Babe, you already have enough on your plate," he'd say. "Let me handle this. It's literally what I do for a living." And I believed him. Why wouldn't I? This was the man I'd built a life with, the father of my children, the person I'd trusted with everything. But looking back now, I can see the pattern. The subtle ways he'd redirect conversations when I asked about specific investments. The gentle discouragement whenever I mentioned wanting to be more involved in our financial decisions. The insistence that I focus on my career and let him manage the money. He'd even encourage me to travel more for work, saying the commissions would help us build Dylan and Ethan's college funds faster. "Take that Atlanta trip," he'd said just 2 weeks before Dylan's whisper. The bonus from that pharmaceutical contract could pay for Ethan's preschool for the whole year. I remember feeling grateful, thinking how lucky I was to have a partner who supported my ambitions. What I didn't know was that the plan required me to be gone. That Thursday morning when Dylan whispered those words, I was supposed to leave on a 2 p.m. flight. Instead, I spent the entire morning in a fog, replaying his statement over and over in my mind. Children say strange things, I kept telling myself. But something about the specificity bothered me. He hadn't said Daddy has a girlfriend or Daddy has a secret. He'd said lover, and he'd connected it directly to money, to my travel, to a timeline. Where would a 6-year-old learn that vocabulary? That morning I went through the motions, making breakfast, getting Dylan ready for school, kissing Michael goodbye as he left for the office. But my hands were shaking as I poured orange juice. After I dropped Dylan off at school, I sat in my car in the parking lot and called my boss. I need to reschedule Atlanta, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Family emergency. It wasn't a lie, not really. I just didn't know what the emergency was yet. Then I did something I'd never done before. I lied to Michael. I texted him that my flight had been delayed due to mechanical issues, that the airline had rescheduled me for Monday instead of Thursday. Annoying, I typed, but at least I'll be home for the weekend. He responded immediately with a disappointed emoji, and that sucks, babe. Guess we'll have family movie night after all. Something about that response felt off. Not wrong exactly, just slightly too enthusiastic, like an actor who'd over-rehearsed their lines. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Dylan's words had planted seeds of doubt where none should exist. But I couldn't shake the feeling. That evening, after the boys were in bed, I did something else I'd never done. I sat down at Michael's home office computer while he was in the shower. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't even know what I was looking for, but I opened our bank account and just started scrolling. At first, everything looked normal. Mortgage payment, electric bill, grocery store charges, gas stations. Then I noticed something small, almost insignificant, a recurring transfer of $300 every month to an account number I didn't recognize. It was labeled Investment Portfolio B in the memo line. I'd never heard Michael mention a Portfolio B. We had our retirement accounts, Dylan and Ethan's 529 college savings plans, and our joint savings. That was it. Or so I thought. I took a screenshot and kept scrolling. More transfers. Small amounts. Never enough to trigger attention. $50 here, $200 there, all going to accounts with clinical numerical labels that revealed nothing. Over the past 2 years, it added up to nearly $40,000. I heard the bathroom door open upstairs and quickly closed the browser, my pulse racing. Michael came down in his pajamas, smiling, asking if I wanted to watch an episode of that cooking show we'd been following. I smiled back and said sure, and we sat on the couch like we did every Thursday night, his arm around my shoulders, my mind spinning through possibilities I didn't want to name. The next morning I called in sick to work, and after dropping Dylan off at school with Ethan at my mother's house, I drove to a coffee shop 3 towns over where I was certain I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. I opened my laptop and started digging deeper. I logged into our credit card accounts, something I'd only done sporadically over the years, always trusting Michael's assurances that everything was handled. What I found made my hands go cold. Hotel charges in Charlotte during a week Michael had told me he was at a consulting conference in Boston. Dinner reservations for 2 at expensive restaurants on nights he'd said he was working late. Jewelry purchases from stores I'd never received gifts from. And then I found it, buried in the statement from 8 months ago, a charge from a law firm specializing in family law and estate planning. I knew our family lawyer, the one who'd helped us draft our wills when Dylan was born. This wasn't that firm. This was someone else, and Michael had paid them $4,000 for services labeled only as consultation and document preparation. I felt physically sick. I closed the laptop and sat there in that coffee shop, watching people order lattes and chat about their weekend plans, and I felt like I was watching them through glass, separated from normal life by what I was beginning to understand. When I picked up Dylan from school that afternoon, I asked him as casually as I could, "Sweetie, remember what you told Mommy yesterday morning? About Daddy?" He nodded, swinging his backpack. Where did you hear that? I asked, keeping my voice light. He looked at me with those serious brown eyes. Daddy talks on the phone when he thinks I'm asleep, he said. He uses words like that. Lover. And money. And he says your name a lot. My throat tightened. Does he talk to someone on the phone? Dylan nodded again. A lady. She laughs different than you. Her voice is higher. What else does Daddy say? I asked, my hands gripping the steering wheel. He says when you go on the big trip, they'll do the papers. And then everything will be different. He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was telling me about his day at school. Did Daddy know you were listening? No, Dylan said, looking out the window. I'm quiet, like a spy. I wanted to cry. Instead, I took him for ice cream, and we sat in the park, and I watched him play on the swings while my mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. That night, I waited until Michael was asleep. Then I went downstairs and called the one person I knew would believe me without question, my sister Rebecca. She'd been through a difficult divorce 3 years earlier and had come out the other side with hard-won wisdom about trust and documentation. I told her everything. The whisper, the bank transfers, the hotel charges, the lawyer fee, everything. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said 5 words that changed everything. Don't confront him yet. Document. Over the next week, I became someone I didn't recognize. I hired a forensic accountant that Rebecca recommended, a woman named Patricia who specialized in uncovering hidden assets in divorce cases. I met her in her office on a Wednesday afternoon, Michael thinking I was at a client presentation. Patricia listened to everything, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook, her expression neutral and professional. How much access do you have to accounts and statements? She asked. Everything's joint, I said. Or, at least I thought it was. Good, she said. I need you to print everything you can access. Bank statements, credit cards, investment accounts, any financial documents in the house. Also, does he have a home office? I nodded. Check for documents when he's not home. Look for account statements, correspondence, anything with letterhead from financial institutions you don't recognize. I felt like I was betraying him, even though the evidence was mounting that he'd been betraying me for possibly years. But Patricia was clear. If you want to protect yourself and your children, you need to know exactly what you're dealing with before he knows you know. So, I became a spy in my own home. When Michael went for his Saturday morning run, I photographed every document in his file cabinets. I found statements for bank accounts I'd never heard of, investment portfolios in his name only, and a folder labeled long-term planning that contained printed emails between him and someone named Jennifer discussing asset protection strategies and optimal timing for transition. I photographed everything, my hands shaking so badly I had to retake several shots because they came out blurred. That's when I found the draft power of attorney documents. They were dated 2 months earlier, prepared by the same law firm I'd seen on the credit card statement. The documents would give Michael complete control over all our joint assets, effective immediately upon my signature. There was even a notary acknowledgement section prepared and waiting. My signature line was blank, but there was a sticky note attached with a date written on it. The date of my original Atlanta trip. The trip I'd canceled. The trip I was supposed to be on right now. I sat there on the floor of his office, surrounded by evidence of systematic betrayal, and understood with crystal clarity what had been planned. I was supposed to be in Atlanta. While I was gone, Michael would have had me served with divorce papers claiming abandonment of the family. The power of attorney documents, which I now suspected he planned to have me sign under some pretense before the trip or forge my signature on afterward, would give him control of everything. By the time I returned from Atlanta, our accounts would be drained, assets would be transferred, and I'd be fighting an uphill legal battle to prove fraud while he claimed I'd willingly signed everything before leaving on an extended business trip. It was elegant in its cruelty. Methodical. Planned. And it nearly worked. I took the documents to Patricia, who reviewed them with another lawyer in her office, a man named David who specialized in family law fraud. This is conspiracy to commit financial fraud, David said, his jaw tight. If he'd executed this plan, You would have been devastated financially, and proving it was fraud would have taken years and cost more than you'd likely recover. What do I do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We freeze everything, Patricia said. Today. We file for legal separation. We alert all financial institutions to flag any attempts to access or transfer assets, and we prepare a criminal complaint for attempted fraud. Criminal? I felt dizzy. Sarah, David said gently, this isn't just a man having an affair. This is premeditated financial abuse with intent to defraud. The power of attorney documents alone, if he forged your signature or coerced it, that's a crime. They walked me through the process. Emergency motions, asset freezes, protective orders. Within 72 hours, every account we owned was locked down. Michael received notification that I had filed for legal separation and that all joint accounts were frozen pending investigation. I wasn't there when he got the papers. The lawyer advised me to stay with Rebecca for a few days while they served him, for safety reasons. But Rebecca told me later that he called her, his voice shaking, asking where I was, saying there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that he could explain everything. What do I tell him? Rebecca asked me. Nothing, I said. Let the lawyers talk. 2 days later, Michael's attorney called mine asking for a meeting. They wanted to negotiate, to settle privately, to avoid criminal charges. That's admission of guilt, David told me. They're scared. We met in a conference room, me on one side of a long table with Patricia and David, Michael on the other side with his lawyer, a nervous-looking man who kept adjusting his tie. Michael looked terrible, unshaven, eyes red, like he hadn't slept in days. He tried to speak to me directly, but David cut him off. All communication goes through counsel, David said firmly. They presented their case. Michael claimed the separate accounts were investment vehicles he'd planned to surprise me with, that the power of attorney was a safety measure in case something happened to him while I traveled, that everything had been a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. His lawyer slid a folder across the table containing a proposed settlement. I'd get 60% of all assets, he'd take 40%, we'd share custody, and we'd both sign NDAs prohibiting either of us from discussing the marriage or the divorce. Not a chance, Patricia said before I could speak. She slid her own folder across the table. Inside were all the documents I'd photographed, the hotel receipts, the jewelry purchases, the emails about asset protection, and most damning, phone records showing hundreds of calls between Michael and a number registered to Jennifer Coleman, a woman who, Patricia had discovered, worked as a paralegal at the law firm that had drafted the power of attorney documents. So here's what's actually going to happen, Patricia said, her voice ice cold. Sarah gets 85% of all marital assets as compensation for attempted fraud. You get 15%, and consider yourself lucky we're not pursuing criminal charges that could land you in prison. You'll have supervised visitation with the children until a court determines you're not a threat to their emotional well-being, and you'll sign an affidavit admitting to financial misconduct that we'll hold in reserve in case you ever try to violate the agreement or seek modification of custody. Michael's lawyer looked at Michael, who had gone pale. My client will need time to consider. Your client has 24 hours, David interrupted. After that, we file criminal charges and let a jury decide what attempted fraud looks like. The meeting ended with Michael staring at me across the table, his eyes pleading for something I no longer had to give. That night, back at Rebecca's house with Dylan and Ethan asleep in the guest room, I finally let myself cry. Not for the marriage, which I now understood had been a performance, but for the years I'd lost believing in something that was never real. Michael's lawyer called the next afternoon. They accepted the terms. Within a week, the settlement was signed, notarized, and filed with the court. I got the house, 85% of all liquid assets, and full physical custody, with Michael getting supervised weekend visitation every other week. He was required to maintain his current level of income and pay substantial child support. The affidavit admitting misconduct was signed and stored with my attorney, a permanent insurance policy against future trouble. But the story doesn't end there, because the truth about Jennifer Coleman turned out to be worse than I'd imagined. Patricia's investigation revealed that Jennifer wasn't just the paralegal who'd helped draft the fraudulent documents. She was Michael's girlfriend of 3 years, a relationship that had started at a legal conference in Miami where Michael had been presenting on asset protection for small business owners. The irony wasn't lost on me. Jennifer had apparently seen Michael as her ticket to financial security, and Michael had seen her as both a romantic escape and a co-conspirator in what they'd planned as a clean extraction of wealth from our marriage. What they hadn't planned on was Dylan overhearing those late-night phone calls. When I finally told Patricia about Dylan's original warning, she laughed, a sharp sound without humor. "That child saved you hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of legal hell," she said. "Buy him the biggest present you can afford." But when I asked Dylan about it later, after things had settled and we were back home, just the three of us now, he said something that broke my heart. We were having dinner, spaghetti and meatballs his favorite. Out of nowhere he looked up at me and said, "Daddy told her I wouldn't remember." "What do you mean, sweetie?" "On the phone. He told the lady that I was too young, that I wouldn't remember anything even if I heard. But I do remember. I remember everything." I put down my fork and went around the table to hug him, this small person who'd been protecting me when I hadn't known I needed protection. "You're the bravest person I know," I told him. "You saved us." "I know," he said seriously. "That's what big brothers do." Ethan, only 3 and mostly oblivious to everything that had happened, just kept eating his spaghetti, tomato sauce all over his face. I looked at my 2 boys and realized that children absorb everything, even when we think they're not paying attention, even when we hope they're too young to understand. They see the truth we train ourselves to ignore. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Michael moved to an apartment across town, and Jennifer disappeared from his life the moment the money was locked down. Apparently, love becomes less appealing when the financial incentive evaporates. Patricia told me later that she'd heard through legal channels that Jennifer had moved to Texas with a new boyfriend, another man with assets worth targeting. "She's got a pattern," Patricia said. "Your husband wasn't her first, and he won't be her last." Michael tried to reconcile about 6 weeks after the settlement was signed. He called me late one night, his voice thick with emotion, saying it had all been a terrible mistake, that he'd been confused, that he still loved me, that we could rebuild if I'd just give him another chance. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished, I said, "Do you remember what you told Jennifer about Dylan? That he wouldn't remember?" Silence. "He remembers everything, Michael. Every phone call he overheard, every lie you told, every plan you made. And so do I. There's no coming back from this. There's no rebuilding. There's only moving forward, and you're not part of that anymore." I hung up and blocked his number. The lawyers could handle any necessary communication. Life moved on in that strange way it does after trauma, one day at a time, each one slightly easier than the last. I threw myself into work and got promoted to regional sales director. Dylan started therapy to process what he'd witnessed, and the therapist told me he was remarkably well-adjusted considering everything, that his act of warning me had actually given him a sense of agency that many children of divorce lack. Ethan remained blissfully unaware of most of it, knowing only that Daddy lived somewhere else now, and we saw him sometimes on weekends. I started seeing a therapist myself, working through trust issues and the psychological damage of discovering that 12 years of my life had been built on lies. She asked me one day, about 8 months into our sessions, "Do you think you'll ever trust anyone again?" I thought about it for a long time. "I trust my children," I said finally. "I trust my sister. I trust people who've proven themselves through actions, not words. But trust someone with my heart and my bank account the way I trusted Michael? I don't know if I ever will." "That's okay," she said. "That's not cynicism, that's wisdom." She was right. I'd learned that trust isn't just an emotional calculation, it's a financial one, a practical one, a decision that requires evidence and verification. I'd learned that silence is how betrayal survives, that it thrives in the spaces where we're too polite or too scared to ask hard questions. I'd learned that financial abuse is often invisible until it's too late, disguised as partnership or division of labor or someone being good with numbers. About a year after the divorce was finalized, I was contacted by a journalist writing a story about financial fraud in marriages. Patricia had mentioned my case with my permission as an example of how systematic and premeditated this type of abuse can be. The journalist, a woman named Maria, interviewed me for hours, and when the article finally published, it went viral. Thousands of people, mostly women but some men too, reached out to share their own stories of financial manipulation, of discovering hidden accounts, of partners who'd controlled money as a form of control over the relationship itself. I started speaking at financial literacy workshops, sharing my story not for sympathy, but as a warning. I talked about the red flags I'd ignored, the discouragement from being involved in financial decisions, the separate accounts disguised as investment strategies, the encouragement to travel more when the travel was actually part of the plan. I talked about how intelligent, educated, successful people can still be victims of financial abuse because abuse doesn't discriminate based on competence. I talked about Dylan's whisper and how children often see the truth we're trained to deny. After one of these talks, a woman in her 50s approached me with tears in her eyes. "My daughter told me 3 months ago that something was wrong with my husband," she said. "I dismissed it as children being dramatic. After hearing you, I went home and checked our accounts.
You saved me."
Your sons saved both of us. That's when I understood the real purpose of sharing this story. It's not about revenge or public shaming or even justice, though all of those played their parts. It's about breaking the silence that allows this to happen. It's about teaching people, especially women who've been socialized to be trusting and accommodating, that financial vigilance isn't paranoia, it's self-preservation. It's about validating the instincts we're told to suppress in favor of maintaining peace. Dylan is 9 now, thriving in school, still serious and observant in that way that makes me both proud and sad. He knows he saved us, though I've tried to shield him from the weight of that responsibility. Ethan is 6, the same age Dylan was when he whispered his warning, and sometimes I watch him playing and wonder what he absorbs, what he understands about why our family looks different now. Michael has remarried, ironically to someone in finance, and I hope for her sake that he learned something from what happened. I doubt it, but I hope. His supervised visitation eventually became standard visitation as the boys got older, and he's civil when we exchange them for weekends. We don't speak beyond logistics, and that's exactly how I want it. I eventually started dating again, though with guardrails I never had before. Separate bank accounts, always. Full financial disclosure, mandatory. Prenuptial agreements, non-negotiable. Some men found these requirements offensive or accused me of not trusting them. You're right, I'd say. I don't trust you yet. Trust is earned, not assumed. The ones who argued weren't right for me anyway. The ones who understood, who had their own guardrails from their own experiences, those were the ones worth getting to know. Looking back now, 3 years after Dylan's whisper, I can see how close I came to disaster. If I'd boarded that plane to Atlanta, if I'd dismissed my son's words as childish imagination, if I'd trusted Michael's explanations without verification, I would have returned home to find my life systematically dismantled. The house would have been gone, the accounts drained, my credit ruined, and my children caught in the middle of a legal war I might not have won. All because I believed that trust in a marriage meant not asking questions. But here's what I want you to understand, what I need you to take from this story. Financial abuse is real, and it's common, and it happens to people just like you, people who think they're too smart or too careful to be victims. It happens in marriages that look perfect from the outside, in relationships where one partner gradually assumes control of the finances under the guise of expertise or convenience. It happens when we mistake dependence for partnership, when we confuse control for care. The warning signs are always there. Discouragement from being involved in financial decisions. Separate accounts you don't know about. Unexplained expenses or charges. Encouragement to be less involved in managing money. Anger or defensiveness when you ask questions about finances. Insistence on handling everything alone. These aren't quirks or preferences, they're red flags, and ignoring them can cost you everything. But there's something else I've learned, something that matters just as much. Children see the truth. They haven't yet learned to explain away inconsistencies or rationalize troubling behavior or maintain peace at the cost of reality. When a child tells you something's wrong, listen. Not dismissively, not with that adult certainty that you know better, but really listen. Dylan saved us because I finally, after initial dismissal, took his warning seriously. How many other children are trying to warn their parents about dangers the adults are too invested in denying? I think about that question a lot now, especially when I'm speaking at workshops or talking with people who've reached out after reading the article about my case. How many divorces could be prevented not by saving marriages, but by recognizing they should never have continued? How many children are bearing the burden of adult secrets because we assume they're too young to understand? The answer, I've come to believe, is too many. We underestimate children constantly, assuming their innocence means ignorance, but kids are observant in ways we forget to be. They notice pattern changes, subtle tensions, things left unsaid. And sometimes, if we're lucky, they warn us before it's too late. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd ignored Dylan's whisper, if I'd gone to Atlanta as planned. Michael and Jennifer's plan would have unfolded exactly as they designed it. I'd have returned to divorce papers, frozen accounts in my name but accessible to him through the forged or coerced power of attorney, assets transferred to accounts I'd never known existed. I'd have been starting from nothing, fighting uphill, probably losing. The house would have been sold, the college funds drained, and Dylan and Ethan would have been caught in a custody battle that could have lasted years. That alternate timeline haunts me sometimes, that parallel life where I didn't listen, where I prioritized my work trip over my son's strange warning, where trust trumped verification one last time. But that's not what happened. What happened is I canceled a flight and started paying attention. What happened is I documented everything before confronting anything. What happened is I protected my children and myself with evidence and legal action instead of hoping for reconciliation or believing promises that meant nothing. What happened is I stopped being a victim and became a survivor, not through any virtue of my own but through the wisdom of a 6-year-old who was braver than I was. So here's my question for you. Whoever you are, wherever you're watching this from, would you have believed the child? If your 6-year-old came to you with a whisper that seemed impossible, that contradicted everything you thought you knew about your partner, would you have listened? Or would you have dismissed it, smoothed it over, maintained the peace, boarded the plane? Think about it honestly, because the answer matters. It matters for your financial security, for your children's well-being, for your own sense of reality and truth. It matters because financial abuse thrives in silence, in dismissal, in the assumption that asking questions means not trusting and not trusting means not loving. But real love doesn't require blind trust. Real partnership doesn't require ignorance of finances. Real security comes from verification, from involvement, from asking the hard questions even when it's uncomfortable. The biggest red flag I ignored wasn't any single bank transfer or hotel charge or drafted legal document. It was the pattern of discouragement, the consistent message that I should focus on my strengths and let Michael handle his, that we were a team that worked best when I didn't look too closely at what he was doing with our money. That was the warning I should have heeded years before Dylan ever whispered his warning. But I'm grateful, in a strange way, for how everything unfolded. Not for the betrayal or the pain or the dissolution of what I thought was my forever family, but for the clarity it brought, for the strength I didn't know I had, for the relationships that survived and deepened through the crisis. I'm grateful that Dylan speaks up now when something bothers him, that he knows his voice matters, that he saved us and knows it. I'm grateful for Rebecca, who answered the phone at midnight and never once suggested I was overreacting. I'm grateful for Patricia and David, who fought for me when I was too numb to fight for myself. And I'm grateful, in the most complicated way, for Michael's failure. Because if his plan had worked, I'd never have discovered my own resilience. I'd never have learned to trust my instincts over convenient explanations. I'd never have built the life I have now, smaller and quieter than what I had before, but mine in a way that marriage never was. I'd never have become the person who could stand in front of strangers and say, "This happened to me. It could happen to you. Here's how to protect yourself." That's the story. Not a neat one with a satisfying ending where justice prevails and villains repent, and everyone learns their lesson. But a true one, messy and ongoing, where a child's whisper changed everything, and a mother finally learned to listen. Before you close this video, I want to ask you something. Drop a comment below with the biggest red flag you spotted too late in life. whether in a relationship, a friendship, a job, whatever. Let's build a community of people who aren't afraid to name the warnings they ignored, because that's how we learn. That's how we protect each other. And if this story resonated with you, if you felt it rather than just watched it, hit that subscribe button. Because there are more stories like this, stories about the moments that change everything, stories about the truths we ignore until we can't anymore. Next week, I'll be sharing what happened to another woman who did get on that plane, who didn't have a child to warn her, who lost everything before she knew she was in danger. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening. And if you're in a situation where something feels wrong but you can't name it, if you're dismissing warnings because they seem impossible, trust yourself. Ask the questions. Look at the accounts. Document everything. Because the cost of curiosity is always less than the cost of blind trust. Always.